Imagine walking into a cafe in San Francisco in 1955. You are a stranger.
Within minutes, a man you've never met slips a colorless, tasteless liquid into your drink.
You don't feel it at first.
But then, the room begins to warp. Your sense of self dissolves.
You are no longer a citizen, you are a biological specimen.
This was not a scene from a spy novel. This was a standard operation for the Central Intelligence Agency. Under the shroud of national security, the CIA spent 2 decades conducting experiments on unwitting civilians, using high-dose LSD, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation to shatter the human psyche. They weren't just looking for a truth serum, they were looking for a way to erase a man's identity and replace it with a set of instructions.
This is the documented reality of Operation MKUltra.
A program so secret that its own director ordered the records destroyed to ensure the world would never know the depth of the depravity.
To understand the madness, we must look at the year 1950.
The Cold War had frozen the world into 2 ideological camps. In the West, the fear was not just nuclear annihilation, but a psychological invasion. Reports were filtering back from the Korean War about American POWs who had been brainwashed by the communists. The Pentagon was terrified. They believed the Soviets and Chinese had discovered a secret technique to flip a soldier's loyalty instantly.
In response, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence felt the US was losing the invisible war.
They believed that if the enemy could break the human mind, the United States had to learn how to break it first. This panic created a vacuum of ethics. The mission was simple: find a way to control human behavior, extract information through any means necessary, and create a programmable agent. The goal was an interrogation breakthrough that could crack any spy, regardless of their will to resist.
Enter Sidney Gottlieb.
To the outside world, he was a quiet chemist. Inside the CIA, he was the black sorcerer. Gottlieb was the architect of MKUltra, a man whose clinical detachment allowed him to view human beings as mere chemical equations. He didn't just want to interrogate prisoners, he wanted to explore the boundaries of consciousness. He established secret labs and safehouses, funded through a complex web of front organizations. By utilizing universities, hospitals, and prisons, the CIA could conduct experiments while maintaining a layer of plausible deniability.
The program was formally sanctioned in 1953 by CIA Director Allen Dulles.
It wasn't a rogue operation, it was an institutionalized effort to map the human mind's breaking point.
Gottlieb's vision was an empire of chemicals, where the boundaries between sleep, wakefulness, and madness were blurred by the agency's design.
The program sought an ally in Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a prominent psychiatrist at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal.
Cameron's work was funded by the CIA under the guise of treating schizophrenia. He developed a technique called psychic driving.
It began with a total blackout of the senses, eyes taped shut, ears plugged with cotton, limbs bound.
The patient was then put into a drug-induced coma for weeks, sometimes months.
During this period, they were subjected to loop-recorded messages played thousands of times through a pillow speaker. The intent was to depattern the mind, to wipe the personality clean like a chalkboard, and then rebuild it from scratch. Patients who entered the clinic for minor depression emerged unable to remember their own names or how to use a fork.
The CIA didn't see this as a tragedy, they saw it as a successful demonstration of cognitive erasure. Wait until we reach the chemical frontier, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. In the early 50s, the CIA viewed LSD as a potential weapon of mass disorientation.
They called it Operation Midnight Climax. In 2 safe houses in San Francisco and New York, the CIA hired sex workers to lure men to these apartments. Once the target was unsuspecting, the agents would administer LSD and observe the subjects through 2-way mirrors. They wanted to see if the drug could make people suggestible or if it could be used to induce a permanent state of psychosis. These citizens had no idea they were part of a government experiment. They were simply people on a date who suddenly found their reality splintering. The CIA spent years documenting the reactions of these unwitting victims, noting how thresholds of panic and euphoria could be weaponized for intelligence gathering. The scale of MKUltra expanded into an intricate web of 149 subprojects.
Some focused on hypnosis, others on radiation, and some on the intersection of drugs and torture. In some cases, the CIA experimented on the most vulnerable, prisoners at Vacaville and inmates in state hospitals. These people were often told they were receiving free medical care in exchange for their participation. In reality, they were being bombarded with high-voltage electroshock therapy, voltages far exceeding standard medical doses, combined with paralytic drugs to prevent them from thrashing during the seizures. The agency was attempting to find a reset button for the human brain. They wanted to know if a person could be forced into a state of total obedience, or if a sleeper agent could be created who would only activate upon a specific verbal trigger. One of the most harrowing aspects was the pursuit of deep hypnosis. The CIA attempted to induce post-hypnotic amnesia, where a subject could perform a complex task like stealing a document or assassinating a target and then have no memory of ever having done so. They used a combination of sensory deprivation tanks and chemical catalysts to break the subject's ego. In the White Room experiments, subjects were stripped of all stimuli for days on end. The result was almost always a psychotic break. But to the analysts in Langley, these breaks were not failures, they were the opening of the mind. Once the old identity was shattered by isolation and drugs, the agency believed the new, controlled identity could be seamlessly implanted. This was the blueprint for the Manchurian Candidate, a fantasy that drove millions of taxpayer dollars into real-world torture. The experiments didn't just happen in labs, they happened on the CIA's own staff. In a move of staggering arrogance, some agents began dosing them. As the 1960s progressed, the program's reach touched the fringes of the counterculture. While the public knows Timothy Leary as the high priest of LSD, he actually began his research with CIA funding. The agency wanted to know if LSD could help them crack the minds of foreign diplomats. They used the burgeoning psychedelic movement as a screen, hiding their clinical torture in plain sight. By the time the program began to wind down in the early 70s, thousands of people had been dosed without consent. The CIA had created a map of human suffering, documenting exactly how much pain and confusion a person could endure before they lost the ability. For decades, MKUltra was a ghost story. A conspiracy theory for the paranoid. That changed in 1975. Following the Watergate scandal, the Church Committee was formed to investigate intelligence abuses. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed a cache of 20,000 documents that had survived a purge. In 1973, Director Richard Helms had ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. He wanted the evidence gone. But some files were stored in financial records and missed the shredder. When the public finally saw these documents, the horror was laid bare. The files detailed the safe houses, the unwitting subjects, and the calculated cruelty of the subprojects. The CIA had not just spied on foreigners, they had waged a psychological war against their own citizens. The declassified records proved that the government viewed the human mind as a piece of software to be hacked and rewritten. The impact of these revelations was seismic. The 1977 Senate hearings revealed that the CIA had violated every ethical code of medicine and human rights. Victims, some of whom had spent years in psychiatric wards not knowing why their personalities had collapsed, finally had a name for their trauma. However, the truth was incomplete. Because so many files were destroyed, many victims will never know what was done to them. The government's defense was that the program was a necessary response to the Cold War. But the evidence showed that the results were largely inconclusive. The CIA spent millions of dollars and destroyed countless lives, only to find that a programmable human was an impossibility. They hadn't discovered the secret to mind control, they had only discovered the most efficient ways to break a human being. Looking at the documents, a terrifying pattern emerges. The techniques developed under MKUltra, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and chemical inducement, did not disappear when the program was officially terminated. They were simply rebranded. These enhanced interrogation techniques resurfaced decades later in the black sites of the War on Terror. The legacy of MKUltra is not just a series of failed experiments, it is the institutionalization of torture. The agency learned that if you can control a person's environment and their chemistry, you can make them believe anything. The boundary between intelligence gathering and psychological torture was erased in the 1950s, and it has remained blurred ever since. The files show a persistent belief in the agency that the law is a suggestion, and the human mind is a tool. What remains of the MKUltra legacy? A handful of lawsuits, a few meager apologies, and a permanent scar on the trust between the citizen and the state. The CIA's official stance was that the program was a response to a specific historical threat. But the reality is that the target was often anyone the agency deemed expendable. The marginalized, the mentally ill, and the unsuspecting. The horror of MKUltra wasn't just the drugs or the shocks, it was the absolute certainty the architects had that they were above the law. They believed that in the name of freedom, they could strip a person of their fundamental autonomy. This is the paradox of the secret state, the attempt to protect the mind of the many by destroying the minds of the few. We must ask ourselves, what else remains shredded? If the CIA was willing to operate a global network of torture and drug administration for 20 years without a single one of its participants speaking out, what other programs are currently operating in the shadows? The 20,000 documents we have are a fraction of what existed. For every file that survived, 10 were burned. The ghosts of MKUltra still haunt our understanding of psychological warfare. We are left with a fragmented history, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The program was officially ended, but the appetite for control never truly vanishes. It only evolves, moving from the chemistry of the brain to the algorithms of the digital age. Operation MKUltra stands as a warning. It is the ultimate proof that power, when unchecked and hidden from the public eye, will eventually devour the very people it claims to protect. The quest for the Manchurian candidate ended in failure, but it succeeded in proving that the human spirit can be pushed to the edge of extinction. As we move further into an era of neuromodulation and targeted behavioral influence, the lessons of the 1950s are more relevant than ever. The most dangerous weapon in the world is not a bomb, but a secret, especially one that tells you that your mind is no longer your own. Stay vigilant. Question the narrative. Because history proves that the most unbelievable stories are often the ones that were